Oh, that's lovely. Okay.
Yeah, I was recently Thanks for your picture. I know you like probably looking at the movie, but
All right. Smart.
before that was a lot of very much fail.
Smart. All right. All right. Let's jump in here. The coffee maker is distracting. Apparently, let's put it down. All right. So, I hope everyone is doing okay. Anything I need to talk about? I guess like two really quick things. So obviously, right, when it comes to the major lab, I'm working on it. I'm hoping to have it done early next week, like before our class next week. But it's just they're long, so it takes me a long time to get through each of them. So stand by. I'll get them done. They'll definitely be done before reading week. But I'll have them, as quickly as I can. I know it'll have been like 2 weeks, and I endeavor to get things back as quick as I can, but it doesn't always work out. This room appears to be falling apart. Okay, nice. Good to know. Should have brought my drill and some screws and I could patch that up. Okay, what else? Next week, obviously, there is a lab. So I haven't changed the due date in the system yet for the 5th mini lab. But that is, on my to-do list. And you'll definitely have the 4th one back before that one is due. So that is all good. If you want to see your midterm exam, because midterm grades are obviously posted, just make an appointment with me. And we can, get that taken care of, as soon as possible. I'm trying to think, is there anything else that I need to talk about before I jump in here? I think we're all good. There's a lab next week, either Tuesday or Wednesday. I think that's everything. My dragon has something on his nose. Much better. Oh, silly education. With your silly whiteboards. Okay. Anything you want to address before? Yeah, please.
I just want to confirm the final exam is non-cumulative.
Yes, non-cumulative. Yeah. Yes, it's non-cumulative, so it'll only cover qualitative. Yeah. So it'll be, the first one was on quantitative, and it'll be really similar format. It is, however, worth 1 less mark, because this one was out of 51 and that one will be out of 50, just because there's that one question and I couldn't figure out how to mark it out of 5, so I made it out of 6. Similar format, 30 multiple choice, 4 short answer, 2 that are like information, 2 that are application based. So, it's exactly the same, just with qualitative research. So, yes, you can forget all about quantitative research, except for one important thing. There is the last part of the 2nd major lab is think of a mixed method kind of way of doing this study. So you'll have to think of a quantitative kind of component for it. But aside from that, you can erase it from your mind and let it go. Let it go. It won't hold you back anymore. Okay. I need reading week so bad. All right. So, anything else? Are we good? Our numbers dwindle by the day. Soha said she'd be here, but she's not, and I'm sad. It's like, oh yes, I will absolutely be there today. Liar. All right. I only know her because she's at a couple classes with me. Okay. So we ended off on this slide, right? We were talking about prep before the interview and all of that fun stuff. And I sort of said, be well prepared, know who you're interviewing if you can, build rapport, be ready to build rapport. A lot of good preparation hides a multitude of sins, if you will. All right, and we're going to start talking about the different types of questions. And I will say, for the midterm, or for the final rather, and for, your major lab, you will definitely want to know these types of questions and kind of what they look like. So the first one is, the first type is pretty obvious, right? It's an introducing question, right? So this is sort of your entry point into the topic, right? So you want to get them talking about, whatever you're interviewing them about. And your introducing question is sort of usually pretty general, but some way to kind of get the conversation started. When I was talking to Brits who were, you are here. I'm just kidding. I thought you had lied to me on email that you weren't actually coming.
I bust off for like 10 minutes for no reason.
I love it when they do that. This is why the moral of the story is transit sucks. You should kill the planet by driving a car. That's all I have to say. The bigger, the better. That's the Alberta way. It's like I could get it by with like a Honda Fit, but instead I'm going to drive a Ford Expedition because that's how Alberta rolls. Okay, so yeah, when I was interviewing people in especially Brits who, ended up going over and working in the TV industry in Russia, it was like, so I got to ask, how did, a guy from Manchester end up working for 6 years for a TV company in Moscow, right? So, this is perfectly fine, but it's kind of a little bit bland. It's like, when did your interest in being a furry begin, right? God, why? But there's lots of different ways that you could kind of phrase this, right? But it's just a way to get people to start talking. Like, when did you first know that you wanted to be a nurse, right? When did you, what was it like going through basic training in the U.S. Army, right? Like whatever you happen to be talking about, what was your first encounter with the criminal justice system, right? When were you first incarcerated, right? All of these sorts of things are introducing questions to get you in and kind of start the conversation. Okay, so introducing questions are pretty easy. They are super important, and right, when you're writing your interview guide, they should basically be kind of the first thing. Because right, that's how you're going to start the conversation. Okay. Follow-up questions, again, pretty straightforward, and I think really kind of easy to understand. Right, you're going to ask people, they said something that you found interesting and you want more information about it, right? So you're asking a follow-up question of some kind. Like, you want people to elaborate on an answer, right? This is actually, when you said you were motivated, what did you mean by that? When you saw that first furry walking around in Atlanta and you were fascinated, what did you find so fascinating about it, right? Any kind of thing like this, like you're, in a lot of cases, rephrasing, right? Thinking of, or like, okay, you said, that you always knew you were going to end up in prison. Why did you think that, right? You're taking something that you want to know more about that they said and sort of, pitching it back to them. You can repeat what they said and kind of go from there. So they're pretty easy questions to ask, but one of the challenges with, say, a follow-up question is that you can't script it, right? So it is an extremely important type of question because it's the questions that are going to allow you to go from what you thought was interesting about the topic to what they said that is interesting about the topic and kind of direct the conversation to follow that rabbit trail, right? But you can't script them in advance. Now you could have, I feel like my coffee maker is now making this chair stick out too much, and I keep hitting it with my foot. So my coffee maker has to move. I'm going to move it 7 times during the lecture. Now it lives here. No, the chair is too tall. It wasn't the coffee maker's fault after all. I just hate... Oh, God. Okay. Now I can't drive my car. There's too much furniture in these rooms. Always. I hate them so much. I'm not just grumpy because I left my tea in my van. It's actually... Yeah, it's like, actually... I'm like, something's missing. I'm like, I'm sure it's in my backpack. It's not in my backpack. It's sitting in the cup holder in my car, I'm sure. It was even in my favorite purple clicky mug. What's that? But I don't have any pods. Those are in my office. And I need water. Excuses. It's true. Just grouchy. What would I put it in? I could just stick my face under the coffee maker and drink it, I suppose. Or like soak it into this eraser and like, I don't know. See, now you got me in a bit and now we're stuck. Anyway. All right. Let's move on. Yeah, so follow-up questions, it's like a normal flow of a conversation, right? You're having a conversation with your friend over coffee, and they tell you something, and you kind of follow it up, right? You want to know more. They're very natural, but again, you can't script them, so that can be the challenge. This is where also, when you're doing an interview, potentially, you might need to take notes, right? Just on an iPad or on a piece of paper, just because conversations can flow very, very quickly. And you want to make sure that if you have a follow-up question, you don't want to interrupt someone, right? If they're kind of on they're on a topic and they're saying interesting things, but there are things you want to know more about, you need to kind of be jotting them down. So that you remember what they were, because conversations will get away from you really quickly, especially if you have, one of the great interviews where it goes for like 2, 3, 4 hours, right? Like you can forget a lot of stuff and they might have said tons of interesting things. But again, they're going to get really grumpy with you. I almost said a bad word. Grumpy with you if you keep interrupting them every time you're like, wait, I want to know more about this. What you said. And they're like not done their thought. So you have to kind of keep them in the back pocket. And take them out when there's a... Interesting. I don't know what to do. I don't know what... Okay, is it my adapter? Did the cable die? What is happening? I'm scared. Hang on. Okay. Static. Now no static. Okay. I'm genuinely confused. That's what I get for buying like the cheapest HDMI adapter on Amazon. It's like, ooh, $6 for 2. That's what I get. Okay, I'm probably good with follow-up questions. Probing questions, kind of a form of follow-up question, right? Short general questions inviting the respondent to reflect more deeply on what they already said with a particular detail, right? So stuff like, what did you mean by this, right? You said, I'm trying to think of an example, right? I'm thinking prison now. You said snitches get stitches. What do you mean by that? Like, what does that actually mean in the context of prison, right? Or, you said everybody knows that this is how things work in prison. What do you mean by that? What do you mean everybody knows? Is it like something that everybody talks about? Is it something that's just kind of common knowledge? How does everybody know this? You said that, everybody just kind of knew not to say certain things on Russian TV or not to depict certain things. Can you give me an example of when that happened to you and kind of what that looked like? Like, what do you mean that people didn't depict things? Like, what did you mean, right? How so? How so can be, I guess if they end on a statement, it's like, yeah, everybody, or I'm trying to think of what a statement like that would look like. You can just kind of probe like, oh, what do you mean? Like, oh, how so? Can you give me an example is always a really good one. Again, pretty easy. At the end of the day. So that's probing questions. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah, please. Sorry.
It's not different from a follow-up.
So it's kind of a form of a follow-up question, right? In this case, you might not be like completely restating what they said, right? It's like, can you give me an example, right? So it's like you want deeper information, but it wouldn't be like, so you said snitches get stitches. What do you mean by that? It would be like, a little bit more like, can you give me an example of a time where a snitch got stitched? That's a terrible example. I'm trapped in it now. Yeah, please.
So it's basically a form of follow-up, but more specified.
Yeah, and short, right? Like really, really short. You can use it more as an interjection too, right? Like if you really want to get into something, there's a really, a short pause. You can interject one of these. It's kind of an interruption. You don't want to do it too much. Everybody knows that this is just the way Catholics are. Oh, what do you mean by that? Like, what do you mean? That's just how Catholics are, right? Hopefully you could imagine what I'm talking about. Did you have another question?
I'm just clarifying. So when you would do a follow-up question, it would be after they complete their entire statement, you would be like, oh, you said this, do this, and then you would probing, you would be like, they said, oh, the Catholic Church or whatever, and you'd be like, oh, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Right?
Well, what do you mean by that? Right? Oh, or, this always happened. Oh, can you give me an example of a time it happened? And then they might, kind of specify things. And again, so you can see it like you're not restating things, but you're just kind of like, give me a little bit more detail. Specifying questions, again, sort of a follow-up question. But this is usually to kind of gain specifically factual information, like a sequence of events, right? So it's like, oh, what happened that next? Like, we were talking to the Pope and he said this, and you're like, oh, what happened then? Like what, then we were escorted out by the Swiss Guard, right? Okay. That's a very fanciful example I came up with just then, right? Or what did you do then, right? You watch someone get, beat up in prison. Well, what did you do then? Like what happened after, right? Well, if they just stop, it's like, yeah, and that's when, Marco got beat up by the skinheads in prison. It's like, oh, what did you do then? Like, what happened? Did you call a guard, right? Like you're looking for the next kind of thing in a sequence of events to kind of reconstruct things a little bit. Excuse me. Does that make sense? Do you kind of see, everyone sees the difference between those things? I know these seem boring and you're like, yes, this is kind of... All right, do I have a plan B? I always have a plan B. For those watching at home, it's very confusing because they don't see the static, so they're wondering what broke. We're not going to tell them because it's more fun to make them wonder what fun they're missing in class. All right, let's hope this works. Well, someone stole the other one. My boss, as it turns out, because she needs it. Ta-da. See? So this one is a VGA adapter, so it's different. But I had two of these, which again I bought, maybe it was like $8, and one of them has disappeared. The very reputable company, Ben Fay, which we've all heard of. Should have gone to Staples. Okay. And paid $45 for an adapter that would probably break in the same amount of time. Yeah, exactly. All right. So direct questions and indirect questions. So direct questions are pretty straightforward, right? Direct questions are there to basically let you access the person you're talking to's perceptions, right? Right? Do you find it easy to keep smiling when serving customers, right? What's your opinion of? What do you think about this, right? Um, you know, how do you relate to the correctional officers in prison? What's your, how do you feel about this, right? Anything where you're really asking someone's opinion and their direct perceptions, you're talking about a direct question, right? So most of the style, dang, I really need tea. Most of the style guides for interviewing, when you look at them, will suggest that basically, these are best left till later in the interview so that you don't influence the direction of the interview too much. Now, I've never really paid attention to that particular article of most of the style guides on interviewing, right? Because I'm much more interested in kind of flow when it comes to doing interviews. It's like, how is the conversation flowing? What's the best time? And a lot of it is really subjective, and you're kind of building this in your head as you go. But yeah, like if you look at go to the library and pick up like a beginner's guide to interviewing, they're going to give you advice like this, best left until later in the interview so that you don't influence the direction too much, right? Starting to ask people's opinions can in theory cascade into them ranting potentially, or going too much into their perceptions. You might miss out on some factual details, right? So you don't want to potentially leave it. You don't want to do it too early, potentially. But again, I think you have to use your judgment as an interviewer to be like, when would a good time to ask these sorts of questions be? And I don't think there is a right and wrong question. Indirect questions would be, these are sometimes a little bit tricky, but they can be ways of getting people to be really honest, right? So I taught you, when we were talking about survey questions, I don't know if you remember, I talked about the neighbor question, right? This is a thing that was discovered in 2016, that in order to get, really clear information about who was going to vote for Trump and who wasn't, because there was a bit of social desirability bias, people started asking the neighbor question, like, who do you think your neighbor is going to vote for? Because it's assumed that people are, similar to their neighbors in major ways. The indirect question is kind of like that. So you can ask it, their perception of other people, but the most kind of common and I think interesting way of asking an indirect question is, what do most people like? Instead of asking their opinion, ask what they think other people think, right? Now, again, this is in large part, I think, going to be a reflection of what they think and their perceptions, but it's a way of getting them to kind of separate from their own opinion and often tell you or maybe decrease that social desirability bias, right? Or their worry about, let's say that you're in a charge situation, right? You're doing interviews in a workplace, and you want to know what people think about the management style of the person running it, right? But that there might be some worry, right, about things that they said getting back to management. And so you can ask them as a sort of indirect question, right? Rather than saying, Carly, what do you think about the management style of Enterprise Rent-A-Car? And Carly might be like, oh, it's great. Yeah, it's perfect. Love it. Love the opportunities, right? Because she's worried that her manager is going to overhear or it's going to get back to her in some way. But if you ask, so what do most people around here, right? What do the other employees, like, what do the employees feel about the corporate structure, at Enterprise Rent-A-Car? You might get a more honest answer, because suddenly now Carly isn't answering what Carly thinks. Carly is answering her perception of what other people think, which is what she's been talking about with her coworkers. But you're more likely to get an honest answer in some senses because she doesn't have to expose anybody or herself, right? She could be like, yeah, I think most people around here kind of feel like this place is a pyramid scheme. Absolutely a pyramid scheme. only know this because I worked in it for 3 years, but I never bought in. I don't know. That's important for me to tell you, but I don't know why. That I never bought into the hype. I just worked there and washed cars in a wool suit. It was super fun in the summer. Okay, so does that kind of make sense? The direct and indirect questions. Okay. Oh, I have this slide again for some reason, and those ones again, and I copied these slides twice, but I have much better pictures on these ones. Okay. There we go. That's where it should be. Suddenly I'm worrying that I don't have enough content for today, and you're like, yes, we get to go home early. We got lots of time. Okay, so structuring questions. Structuring questions can sometimes be just a way of redirecting a conversation, moving it back to almost inevitably, right? An interview is going to get off topic, right? And it might be necessary to go back to your interview guide and kind of redirect the conversation, right? Someone is talking about, that you ask them about, what their coworkers are like at Enterprise Rent-A-Car, and suddenly, your interviewee, Tom, just starts going on and on about how, it's so terrible that all the female employees try to sleep with the upper management so that they get promoted. And you're like, okay, Tom he's, off the reservation. Not a real thing, but it may have happened. Tom is off the reservation completely, right? He's completely lost the point of what you were trying to get at. And then you could be like, okay, well, that's really interesting. I would like to move, I do need to move on to a different topic because I have this other thing I want to ask you, right? And then you would kind of pair that up with, probably an existing question on your interview guide. Structuring questions are almost more like phrases that you use to move the conversation from one spot to another, right? That basically, you're kind of moving it on, and especially if it's kind of strayed off into a direction that isn't necessarily where you want to talk about, or the conversation has kind of died, right? You hit a kind of point where nothing else is coming, and you don't know what else to ask about a topic. You can use a structuring question to then redirect, right? And move it hopefully back to one of the other kind of topic areas you want to talk to a person about, right? Mine was very awkward. I was like, yeah, let me just take a little There we go. Okay. I forgot to recharge it last night, and it doesn't have a big battery, so there we go. Yeah, I mean, so you have to kind of strike this balance when it comes to harm, right? Because a lot of times for sociologists, you do want to ask, important questions. You do want to ask questions that get to the core of some really difficult human experiences. Now, like I said, you can do this sometimes in terms of the information and consent letter. Some of your structuring questions can help in this regard as well, right? To give people a chance, if they're really uncomfortable and don't want to talk about something, that you haven't even asked the question, right? So it's like, use the structuring question to say something like, so now I'd like to turn to kind of your family history, and if there was any abuse, in the house where you grew up, is that okay, right? You can give people then a chance to be like, no, that's way too uncomfortable. I'm really sorry. I don't want to talk about that. And then you can kind of back off, right? And you can maybe try to get at it from other angles. So the structuring question can be useful there in helping to avoid harming people and asking them about things that might re-traumatize them, right? And again, there's lots and lots of things that could re-traumatize a person at the end of the day. So you do want to... You do want to kind of avoid that. Okay. Another tool that you can use, and this is another type of question. This is what's called a vignette question. This is my favorite kind of question to use on multiple choice exams in SOS 100 because it's soul crushing to students and they almost inevitably get the story wrong. But they're incredibly useful little tools, right? So a vignette, I've re-traumatized our friend in the front row here. This is how I maintain my perfect average within the boundaries that the department sets for SOS 100. I love vignette questions because people get lost in the story and they overinterpret it, and then failure inevitably follows. Or 75%, which is exactly the average that the department tells me I should have for SOS 100, by the way. Okay, works out every time. Vignette questions are basically where you kind of present a scenario, right? And again, this can be a sort of interesting way of getting away from social desirability bias, right? Instead of asking Carla what she would do in this situation, you set up a little story, right? So like, you are the manager of Enterprise Rent-A-Car and a customer comes in with a damaged vehicle, but one that they swear they didn't damage. What do you think, and now your employee, Tim, is getting into an argument with them about the damage. What is the normal way that Enterprise would tell you to handle that, right? So you can get that information through this little story. And now, she's thinking the story, right? Instead of, specific people, she's thinking of the story you've told and she can be kind of objective. Or it's like, what do you think someone should do in a situation where, X happens, right? What would be the normal way that people should react? You can get information. And again, by depersonalizing it, they can be really useful. You can tell a story, right? Rick is a longshoreman from New Jersey, right? And I don't know, you can imagine vignettes being done in a million different ways. All good? Okay. All right. So after the interview, one of the things you need to do is field notes, right? So field notes are also important when you're doing interviews. Now, in some circumstances, right, people are quick enough that they can actually do kind of notes in real time during interviews and still listen. My brain does not work that fast. And so I've never been able to do like field notes while interviewing, right? But what you do after an interview, right, is you want to jot down, any information that was kind of that you think is pertinent, right? So how the interview went, right? You want to talk about how the interview went, how your interactions were. You can do a little self-reflective things. You can be like, yeah, this question worked, this question didn't work. You talk about where the interview was conducted, right? So what was going on in the environment and any kind of environmental factors that you think might have affected the interview in general, right? So, I don't know, you were doing it at Starbucks, and at a certain point, a very loud customer came in and interrupted, the baristas and was berating them, and that put your interviewee on edge. That can be an important thing to say. Anything else, like other feelings raised during the interview, that can be useful. All these sorts of things, right? What was going on around it, right? What was happening? Did they get a phone call? Did anything kind of shift? Did you notice any moments where a question you asked really shifted the person's tone and maybe they pulled back a little bit? Any of that stuff, you want to kind of note it down. And you can be very self-reflexive about the questions you asked and how they worked. In very extreme cases, actually not extreme cases, you can also do this by if you recorded the interview, right, with either video or audio, you can re-listen to it and kind of make notes as to what was going on in particular moments. And again, the sooner you do this, the better, right? The sooner you are able to kind of get there, the more likely your memory is to be consistent with what was actually happening. When I've done sometimes I haven't done it with interviews, but with focus groups, I've had an assistant taking notes, like essentially field notes in real time about what was going on. And that can be really useful too. But you do need kind of field notes, right? Just about the interview, about anything you can remember that is relevant, so that again, you can look back on it 5 years later when you go back to this data and have access to that information again. Okay. Interview topics can be just about anything, right? People's values, people's beliefs, things they've done, behaviors, their roles within any kind of social situation they're in. Formal, informal, right? I don't know, like I've seen accounts of workplaces where basically they, the formal role of the kind of administrative assistant, and then her informal role often as the quote unquote work wife, right? Essentially like the person who organized her boss's kind of work life in the way that a wife might for a husband, right? You could talk about any of those things like, hey, I've heard the term work wife thrown around sometimes with regards to you and your boss. Can you tell me a little bit about that? You can ask about, those formal and informal roles, relationships, how people get along, what their relationships are with prominent people, important other members of communities, right, within their families, anything, places, emotions, encounters, stories, right, events that happen. Any of these things can be fodder for interviews, right? So almost anything you can imagine. Yeah. You need to, it's a really good idea. You should be, if you're doing interviews, recording your interviews somehow, right? You can't rely on your memory. And the tools now, like I said, we're in the golden age of recording equipment, right? Your laptop and a cheap microphone from Amazon, you can do great things, right? So you should be recording it. One thing you will have to do when you do record stuff is obviously, pardon me, in your information and consent letter, you should have the information that this interview will be recorded, right? And transcribed. And if anyone else is going to have access to the recordings, right? So if the recordings are going to be accessible to the entire research team, you should let people know, right? So that then they have informed consent. They know how the data is going to be used. They can make an informed decision. So if it's just going to be you, just tell them, I'm going to be the only one that has access to the recordings. If it is going to be your research team of 75 graduate students, you need to let them know that as well. Same thing with the transcripts. Yeah, so you should have consent to record, and it should be very clear when you record that you tell them, I am starting the recording now, right? Always, so they know when they're being recorded. And then you tell them when you shut it off at the end, is like, I have shut off the recording. So if you want to talk with them kind of informally after in an off the record way, they know what the boundaries are. Just like, again, tips and tricks, things that I've found is a lot of the rapport building that I did with people I've interviewed, even in focus groups, right? These were things that happened in the pre-recording time, right? You sort of joke around with people, you introduce yourself in an informal way to people, you ask them some personal questions. A lot of like the schmoozing I did. So I've told you about the Sony executive that kind of tested me for 15 minutes to see what I knew before we even had started. So I had looked up her biography on LinkedIn and Internet Movie Database. So I knew she had worked on the show Gilmore Girls, right? And this was a show that my wife really loved. So my first thing was like, hey, this is not part of the interview, but I see from your biography that you worked on Gilmore Girls. My wife loves that show. What was it like working on that show? And like, what were the scripts like? Because they talk so much. And it was like a very kind of like Bondy kind of moment, right? Where they were like, oh, you appreciate my work and you bothered to look up who I am before you stepped into the room. So you kind of, appreciate what I've done. And you have nice things. I would not lead with, I hate that show, right? Gilmore Girls sucks. It's a stupid show. Why did you ever work on it? That would be a bad way to build rapport. But if you can find something nice to say about them, or, I don't know, if you're doing interviews within a community, if you know someone from that community, and you could be like, oh yeah, how do you know Tim, right? Or why is Tim today? For some reason, and Social 100, it's always like little Timmy when I'm talking about socialization. I don't know. Tim apparently is stuck in my head. But yeah, like a lot of that rapport building you should probably do before you turn the recording on so that people don't feel on guard or what like they say could end up quoted, right? So it's like all that stuff is off the record. And then, be very clear. It's like, okay, I'm turning the recording on now. And then they know just kind of snap into their official answers. So have consent to record, let them know when you're doing it, and all of that fun stuff. Transcription. Hate transcription. Okay, transcription is a process designed entirely by the devil to torment graduate students. No, it's a terrible process, and I hate it a lot. It is super important, right? Because it's going to speed up your work a lot later. Like when you go to write something up, having all of the things written out so that you can copy paste statements rather than like going and finding exactly what someone said in an interview, listening to it, and then typing it out as you're writing a paper or your dissertation, it's going to be really slow. Transcription is also what allows you to do the coding, right? Because what you're going to do with any kind of interview transcript is you're going to code it, right? You're going to put different statements that people made into different categories that you think are important, that you're going to develop. We'll talk about coding a little bit later. But yeah, I mean, you have to have the written kind of file in order to code things, right? So when you're using, look at that, when you're using, I need tea. This is what's happening. Everything's falling apart because I forgot my tea mug. You need that transcript in order to code, right? Now, coding is, if you do it yourself, I find it a really difficult process. We pay people to do it at the CCR, right? And this is built into our ethics, so don't worry. This is not unethical. We have someone who does the transcription and really likes it and is really good at it and has like crazy setups like noise canceling headphones. The transcription pedal, it's a pedal. No, seriously, you need like special equipment because you can only remember a certain amount of text, right? And instead of like taking your hand off the keyboard to pause stuff all the time, there's a special USB pedal that just pauses the recording for you. So you like get your statement, you hit the pedal, type, hit the pedal to start, pause, type. It's intolerable. And they're expensive. They're like $200 because it's a specialized piece of equipment. You have to go back a million times and rewind the recording, right? Back 30 seconds, back 10 seconds. It's a really obnoxious process. I hate it so much. Training is required. I never got any training, right? You just have to listen and type things, but you have to know kind of how things look. And there's lots of possible errors. You could mishear things, your fatigue, your carelessness, right? And sometimes recordings aren't perfect. So a lot of people, if they're being lazy, and I've had lazy transcribers, they'll put like inaudible, like in quotes, because you can't tell what was said. And if I go back and listen to it, I'm like, oh, I know what they said. The other thing that I had when I was doing transcription of interviews about Russian TV is people would start saying words in Russian, and then the transcribers were very confused. And then I had to go back and fix that later. But that's my fault for being like, oh, you're right. And I should have been doing it myself, but I hated it, so I paid people to do it. That was unethical. Don't tell anyone. Okay. So I think I'm past the statute of limitations on it anyway. Possible errors, it can obviously cause problems if you misquote someone, right? That can be a problem. I guess the transcripts are also useful too if someone wants to check their quotes, right? To check what they said. You can let them look at the transcript and sometimes they'll modify it. I had one person who did this, honestly, of our 2-hour interview, went through the whole transcript and put strike marks through certain statements and was like, I don't like how I said this. Could you say I said this instead? And I'm like, I guess that's the agreement we made. So, okay. Useful in that way too. Okay. But it is obnoxious. Yeah. I mean, be able to vary the order of questions, right? Don't be too rigid when you're doing interviews. Flexibility is also important. Say if your recording equipment doesn't work, that's a traumatic experience. You can go forward with an interview and just kind of take notes and then try to reconstruct it afterwards. I had to do this for a 15-minute section of a focus group I did, where the recorder we used basically for some reason lost a 15-minute section. And so me and the research assistant I was working with, we sort of reconstructed in general terms what was said because we remembered, and then we have it in blocks. It's like reconstruction begins and ends here. So you have to be flexible with that kind of stuff, right? You don't want to stop your interview because your recorder ran out of battery. You might just have to be really flexible with it. Or if you're smart, make sure you have a backup plan, right? It's like, okay, if my recording equipment doesn't work on my phone, well, I have my laptop with me, or I have an iPad, or, we live in a world of endless possibilities. You brought your old phone that's been sitting in a drawer for 2 years, right? Just in case your first phone breaks down, just trust me, have it all set up and ready to go. You have unless you're like one of those people who trades in your old iPhone for a $45 discount on your new one. In that case, I don't know what to tell you. Borrow your mom's phone when you go, or whatever, your partner's, make sure you have backups. Be flexible, be smart. If something breaks, don't let it derail the whole process. Just kind of pivot with it. And trust me, it's going to feel like crap. Because when something goes really wrong, your heart is going to drop. You're going to feel kind of terrible. And it might take a minute for you to talk through and start feeling okay again, but you should be flexible with it. I guess I already talked about this. Know when to switch off your on and on for your equipment, right? What's the informal part? What's the formal part? And be really open about it. People will often tell you the most interesting things, when the recording's off. If it's really interesting, if it's just informal chatter, you don't have to ask. If they say something really interesting to you after you turned off the recording, right? They tell you something they didn't tell you during the recording. You do have to, because there is an expectation that might not appear on the record. You can ask them that was really interesting what you just said. Can I quote you on that, right? And if they say yes, then write it down frantically so that you know what they said. If they say no, obviously, right, they were expecting that comment to be off the record. Now, technically, if they didn't say this is off the record, you could use it, but you will then damage your relationship with that person. So I would say don't do that unless you have an extremely good reason to, or you're never going to see them again, in which case maybe you don't care. But I wouldn't recommend it, right? It's kind of unethical. Me being the arbiter of all things ethical, having only ever done ethical things. Okay. I guess when we're reconstructing or constructing the data, reflecting on the interviews, right? Something to think about is how your own interactions might have affected the participants, what you said, how you said it, what was left unsaid, whether the questions were bad, and especially, with qualitative research being such an iterative process, right? Just always say you're doing grounded theory, right? I'm just going to, because you can then always kind of build on what you did, right? And so, after you've done your first interview, listen to it again, right? Before you do your second interview, if you can, and reflect on, what kind of questions you asked, whether the questions need to be changed, whether the way you asked the questions affected it, whether how you were positioning yourself your posture, the role you kind of adopted, whether that affected the interview and whether that needs to change. It doesn't always have to, right? Like sometimes, Gilmore Girls fanboy was a perfectly adequate way of approaching that interview, right? Because it got the person talking. And you could be like, yeah, that probably put them in a good frame of mind. You could be reflexive about that, but you don't have to then necessarily change it for the next one. It's just like that was a good thing to do, but just kind of reflect on what worked, what didn't work, how it might have affected people. Was that okay? Did it get them talking? Did the way you ask questions, maybe have people off put in such a way as it shut you down, right? Or they shut you down, were there things that they didn't say that you wish they had? And then do you need to maybe request a follow-up interview to go through that stuff? Okay. How am I doing for time? That clock is always wrong. So I'm going to guess it's 11:59. I am correct. It's exactly 5 minutes ahead. Okay. So, focus groups. So focus groups are basically interviews, right? They're a form of interviews with a group of 4 or more people who interact with you and each other, right? So they can build on each other. There's a lot of value in focus groups. A lot of researchers don't like them, specifically because you don't get the depth, right, of a single person's kind of view that you would in an interview, right? Where you can spend an hour and a half with one person and really dig deep into their experiences. You obviously don't have that in a focus group, right? Because you may have, 4. I've seen focus groups of between 4 and 10. I've had focus groups of 10. They are really chaotic and voices get left out. My general recommendation, they're just tempting me with your liquid container. I'm so thirsty. I'm just obviously just teasing you. Yeah, I mean, I've seen focus groups of 10. They're really chaotic and I find voices get left out. I think generally 6 would be the biggest focus groups I would ever want to do. But, for sometimes, you got to adjust and kind of roll with the punches. One of the reasons I ended up in a 10-person focus group is because recruiting people and getting them to actually show up is hard. And so I assumed that of my 10-person focus group, somewhere around 6 to 8 would show up. And that was true. I did like 6 of these. One of them had 4 people show up out of 10. Most of them had 6 to 8. And then one had all 10 people show up. And I was like, well, this is suboptimal, but we roll with it, right? The nice thing about focus groups is they build, right? And one person will say something which will trigger something in another person's kind of brain. Right. And they'll reflect on it. They'll give their own take on it. They'll say how their experience was the same or different. Rather than just you trying to probe them and only thinking what you think to ask, right? The group can actually bring out information that might not have come out otherwise, right? So yeah, you can get a wider variety of perspectives. Brings out why people feel the way they do, and you can get interacting perspectives and a little bit of debate going, which can be really, really, really interesting. Do I have this on the... Okay. They're also really cost effective, right? And time effective, right? So basically, I got to talk when I did these focus groups for the Catholic project I did. I got to talk to, I think I ended up with about 52 people that I talked to in total, right? If I had done 52 interviews, I never would have finished that project because it was just me working on it. So I got a lot of perspectives, maybe not in depth, but very quickly. And I did that in 2 days, right? 2 days, basically 2 weekends I did, these focus groups. And so it was very quick with, and if I'd been doing interviews, I would have been driving all over Edmonton, trying to gather data from people. It would have taken forever. The transcription would have been a costly nightmare, and all of that kind of stuff. So they're very, very cost effective and time effective. And if you are, a graduate student, someone who really or you're on a budget, right? You got funding, but you don't have, it's not a huge amount of funding and you need to be very efficient, a focus group might be the way to go over interviews, because while the interviews might give you more depth, the focus group might give you more breadth, right? And more people that you can talk to. So they are, I think, really practical. Yeah, please.
I don't know if you're interested in this, but like, how do you like go about asking a question for the focus group? Like, if you, because like the interviewer would ask a question and there would just be like a free for all answering, or is there more structure to the participants answering questions? But I was thinking like, what if you did like a talking circle, or you had like, because we did this thing, and you had your talking stick, and if you pass around the talking stick, everyone gets to do it, and then at the end, you have like a more collaborative stage.
Like a melee.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just didn't know like how competitive are people when answering questions? Like how would you structure that to make sure that you're getting an equal voice?
It's a really good question, which was answered on the very next slide.
There we go.
That's why she was laughing, because I tapped it while you were talking. Yeah, so the facilitator, there's a bunch of different ways of doing it. The magic stick is an interesting one because it feels like kindergarten, but I guess it works. I mean, the moderator's role, right, is to direct the conversation, and in a lot of cases, to make sure that everybody has a chance to answer. Because one of the things, and I think you're kind of hinting at this, is in focus groups, you're going to have dominant personalities, right? Almost any time, like anyone who agrees to be in a focus group probably wants to talk, but there's definitely people with like larger than life personalities that will potentially dominate your conversations, right? I remember I was in one focus group, it was Brandy, the public school teacher, and she just wanted to talk about everything. And it was great. You need those personalities in a focus group because they're the one that then people kind of like bounce off of. But you have to make sure that Brandy's not the only one who talks. I don't know why I remember Brandy particularly, but I just remember her like dominating this group of like 6 people and like having to really like be like, okay, Tom, it looks like you're nodding when Brandy's saying this. Do you agree? Right? So the moderator's role is really that, right? To get the conversation going and to keep it on topic, right? That's a really important part of a moderator facilitator job, right? Is you're going to have, similar to an interview, you've got an interview guide or a focus group guide, right? You have some topic areas or questions that you want to make sure get talked about based on your research question. But then your role is to sort of like ask, okay, so there's upsides and downsides to this. Sometimes you want people to talk to each other, but you want to be in control. If you have too much control, then people are just talking to you, right? So if you're the moderator and you're controlling things too much, then the whole have you ever been in a seminar, like a senior seminar, and there's a professor, and everybody just talks to the professor and no one talks to each other? You don't want that in a focus group, and it can be really difficult. So, I mean, I never sit at the head of the table in a focus group, right? I'm always in the middle of the participants so that I am, and often like slightly off to an angle, right? So I would never, like, let's say this is our table, I would sit like here, not here or even in the middle of the table, because I don't necessarily want to be the focal point for everybody, right? I don't know. I don't know if that's actually a trick of the trade. I always do it. Kind of, I'm like, where am I going to sit? I don't want to be ahead. I don't want to be at either end of the table or in the middle. I want to be slightly off to the side so I'm not the focal point in the conversation. Because it can become, the focus group is just you doing really crappy interviews with 6 people at once, right? So you do want people talking to each other, and you want to make sure, the magic wand or the stick of glory, what is it? The stick of truth? Is that the South Park one? The stick of truth. Is a way of making sure everybody has a chance to talk. I don't like that approach specifically because then people might feel a little bit coerced into speaking, right? It's like, you're just passing around the stick so everybody gets a say. But what if Cindy doesn't want to talk about this topic? She just has nothing to say, right? So I like to be I don't know, maybe I'm a control freak. I like to be a little bit more in charge of it and just kind of be like, hey, Cindy, I noticed you haven't said anything in a while. I was just wondering if there's anything you wanted to add to the conversation. And then Cindy can be like, yeah, I really wanted to comment on what Jackie was saying, right? Or she might just say, no, I don't really have anything to say. And you're like, oh, thanks, great, move on. Again, focus group facilitating is more of, I'm going to say this because I'm good at it, is more of an art than it is technical, right? And it's kind of being able to read the room, remember who's spoken, kind of silence the voices, watch what people are doing, right? Like if someone's engaged and they look like they want to jump in, or they're nodding, or they're, like someone says something and they cross their arms and they sit back and it's like, yeah, it looks like you disagree. Did you want to add something to the conversation, right? Like there's a lot of being able to read a room that goes into it. I don't know, this is like the longest, most rambling answer to a question I think I've ever given. And I have given some doozy ramblers.
Hey, I appreciate it because it's getting my brain to think about.
Yeah, so it is honestly, being a moderator, this is what my experience was. So I did 3 in a day one time. And then the next day I slept for like 15 hours. It is exhausting because like the level of alertness that you have is really, really high, right? You are like paying attention to everything all the time. And by the end of the day, your brain is toast. I barely could drive home, honestly. Like driving home, I was like, death. That's how scary it could be. Because the moderator is super involved and you're sort of watching everything. Maybe the stick of truth is a way for the moderator to not have to do that as much and make sure every voice is included. I don't love it because, like I said, sometimes people will get the stick and be like, they feel like they have to talk because they have the stick, but they don't really have anything they want to add, and so it can feel a little coercive. But yeah, I mean, staying on the issue, right, without directing too much is interesting. If people wander really far off the topic, you want to bring things back a little bit, right? Like, if suddenly you're talking about, you have a focus group that you want to talk about Catholic institutions in Edmonton, and people are talking about the provincial government, you probably want to be like, scooch, 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 like let's pull that back a little bit, because people will get off topic and conversations do flow in funny directions without being like, too pointed about it. And obviously when a conversation kind of runs out, you want to introduce a new topic, right? And make sure you get through everything. See where, make sure everybody participates, all that stuff. It's naturalistic. Brings out individual collectivity and make decisions and interpretations. What does that even mean? I guess like when you're talking about the role of say like a focus group, right? You're trying to get kind of collective ideas flowing, and people's interpretations building on each other to see how different understandings interact right within groups and what kind of views you have out in the world. That's like a really long. Did I answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. I'm like, I don't know anymore. What question did you ask even? Like, is the stick of truth a good tool? I think that might have been your question. And my answer was 45 minutes. Okay. I'm glad I answered it. All right. Oh, yeah. How many groups? Researchers should conduct 10 to 15 groups. If, okay, I will say this comes from the textbook. I don't necessarily agree with this because sometimes the number of groups is where you end up in saturation, right? Like if you do 5 groups and then you do the 6th group and you feel like you're not hearing anything new, maybe you don't need to do a 7th group, right? Maybe you don't need to do an 8th group or a 9th or 10th or 15th group. So I think as the researcher, let's just say, in my opinion, there are no hard and fast rules about how many focus groups you should do. You have to make those kinds of decisions, like, have you answered your question? Is this going to be sufficient? Rather than, I hate giving hard and fast rules because then you're going to go out and do your master's and be like, my SOS 315 professor said I needed 10 to 15 groups and I can't recruit that many people because not that many people want to do my focus groups and my project is falling apart and it's the end of the world, right? Like if you can only do 4 focus groups, you only got 4 focus groups and you build on what you got. And honestly, recruiting people to do stuff like this from an academic perspective can be really challenging, right?
because you're asking people to give up some of their time. And what I found is inevitably I have to do focus groups on Saturdays, right? Because during the week, nobody was available. Everybody was at work. So I had to do them on Saturdays. So now I'm asking someone to give up 2 hours on their Saturday to come and sit in a room and eat, sandwiches that I bought from Upper Crust Bakery, drink bad coffee, and talk about their feelings with a bunch of strangers, right? It can be hard to recruit people. So I'm making it sound so charming and wonderful. You all want to do focus groups now. But it is difficult, right, to recruit people to take part. So, I mean, yeah, 10 to 15 focus groups on a big project would be ideal. If you don't get that, don't be like, wow, my project is trash. Sometimes you just run out of people that are willing to participate. Yeah, I mean, if you have really diverse demographics, you might need more to make sure. But you're not. See, this is where again, you don't have to worry as much about this because you're not trying to get a representative sample, right? You're not doing probability sampling with focus groups. You're getting a subsection of people in a community or in a group to tell you things, right? And how big it is will depend on how many people you want to talk to, how big the group is, and these sorts of things. So, yeah, basically you want to do focus groups until you hit theoretical saturation, or the other one where you want to do focus groups is until you hit budget exhaustion, or you run out of money. Because the other thing that you often have to do, so, right, how to put this gently, you have to pay people to show up and do your focus groups, right? Because, like I said, people showing up to a conference room at the university on a Saturday could be a bit of a challenge. So I had to pay people $25, right? $25 gift card in order to participate, right? Now that will soak up, you do, 10 to 15 focus groups, 10 groups of, 6 people, that's 60 people at $25 or more a pop, right? You're going to burn through a budget pretty quickly. And the more you do, right, the more it's going to cost. And for the record, if you go to Walmart and you try to buy a bunch of gift cards, after you get to $800, they don't let you buy anymore, and they ask you to leave the store because they think you're money laundering. Sorry, this happened to me. My boss told me, so we have $4,000 we need to spend at the end of the year last year. And it's like, we're going to need gift cards eventually for the project we're doing in prisons. Can you go and buy $4,000 worth of gift cards? I'm like, I guess. I showed up at the till with like $1,000 of gift cards. And like, you can't buy that many. I'm like, how many can I buy? $800. Okay. Can I just go through another till and get more? And they're like, no, you have to leave the store now. So I had to go to 4 different Walmarts to expend our budget. Anyway, they thought I was laundering money, right? With my U of A corporate card. Anyway, whatever. Researchers, when you can predict what's going to be said in a focus group, right? When you've heard it all, you've reached saturation, you're not getting new information, why continue to put yourself through this? And again, focus groups have to be transcribed as well. And transcribing focus groups, if you thought transcribing interviews was hard, transcribing focus groups is a joy beyond words. Why? Because there can be 6 to 10 voices in that room with you. And whoever's transcribing is going to have to remember which voice that was. If you have video recording, that's one thing. If you have audio only, it can be hard. So, trick of the trade, you start your focus group by having everyone introduce themselves in the recording by name for the transcriber. So that it's like, hey, I'm Jack. I'm 45 years old and I work in construction. And why are you doing that? You are getting them to introduce themselves to each other, but you're also getting their name and a voice that they can associate with for whoever's transcribing your interview so they can recognize that voice. And trust me, I've had to fix transcripts from transcribers who weren't in the room because I listened back to it and I'm like, that's not Jack talking. That's someone else. So, like I said, if you thought transcribing interviews was painful, you ain't seen nothing yet. All right. Oh God, we still have so many more slides. Okay, we'll finish. Why don't we finish this on Tuesday? We got 3 minutes left, and I've ranted enough about focus groups. We'll pick it up here. We'll finish up on Tuesday And then you'll be all set for getting into the lab on Tuesday, which is all about interview questions and how to write them and all of that fun stuff. So, namaste. I must go. No, but I will, and hopefully by then I will have your major labs back to you. If I find a bit of time to work on them this weekend, I should be good to go. All right. And now, I don't know how this recording went. I'm sorry for people who are counting on the recording. My microphone died.